Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to present today and for having me. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, I will be presenting indeed on multi-level policies and multi-level governance of post-2014 migrant integration in small communities. It's a rather long title. I hope it becomes more clear later on what I mean with all these terms. And I will be starting the presentation with saying something about the project that I'm involved in, together with Peter Scholte and Maria Schiller. Then I will say very few words about the concept of multi-level governance before then introducing the case study or the case studies in the Netherlands. Then I will be discussing some results and conclude with some final remarks. The main goal of this presentation is really to give you an insight and a very hands-on practical example of how multi-level governance can be studied in practice and how multi-level governance is also, how it also plays out in different local contexts in the Netherlands and how actors also make policy in a multi-level system. Yeah, we are currently part of a also Horizon 2020 research project that also has received funding from the European Union called HOLCOM. HOLCOM stands for a whole of community approach to integration in small and medium-sized towns and rural areas. And in this project, we look at how especially smaller communities have responded and reacted to the increased arrival of migrants and refugees after 2014. We were, for instance, interested in the type of policies that were developed in the localities, but also in the actors that are involved that negotiate these policies and implement them. But we also, for instance, spoke to refugees living in the localities to see how their lived experiences also look like. In total, there are 13 partners involved, and the same type of research is being conducted in 10 countries. Amongst others, Sweden, Spain, Italy, Germany, Austria, and also, of course, the Netherlands. And this is what I will be focusing on today. There are in total 40 localities that are studied in this project, and in the Netherlands there are 4, which I will introduce them shortly. Just now, a few words about multi-level governance. It's, of course, also a debated concept, but I like the definition provided by Adam and Caponio. So this is what I will be also working with today. They define multi-level governance as the process of dispersion of authority away from the nation state and across interdependent and yet autonomous public authorities and non-public organizations placed at different levels of government. And what is important here is indeed this realization, or also this shift away from only perceiving the nation state as the main actor in policy making and policy implementation, but to really also see how authority and power is given away, is being transferred to, for instance, the EU level, but also to regional or local authorities, and the increasing involvement of not only public actors, but also non-public organizations and private businesses, NGOs, civil society organizations in the policy making and policy implementation process. So really also this intersection of a vertical and a horizontal dimension. The focus so far in multi-level governance has very often been on the involvement of different levels of government and on cooperation and collaboration. But what I will also try to do now, today, and also drawing on Campomori and Ambrosini, is to also go a bit beyond that and really look also more at the horizontal perspective of the diversity of non-public actors that are also involved, and at potential conflicts and tensions that can also emerge in the governance of immigrant integration. Now, the case study in the Netherlands, here a very colorful map. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the geography of the Netherlands. So very briefly, we selected 4 cases, 2 cases in the west of the Netherlands. They are located in a metropolitan region that is also referred to as Randstad. The Randstad is very densely populated. It's economically very strong. The 4 biggest cities in the Netherlands are located in this region, so Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Utrecht, and The Hague. And 2 of our cases are also located here. And then we also selected 2 cases more to the east, so more towards the German border, the east and the northeast of the Netherlands, the one rural area in Drenthe and one small town in Overijssel. These two provinces are much less densely populated, and they also have a different economic structure, different composition of the population. So it was also important for us to really have this sort of geographical variation in our sample of cases. Besides geography and of course size, because we primarily look at medium and small towns, we also considered structural conditions and experience with cultural diversity. So structural conditions means that we also looked at the economic conditions and demographic developments in the 4 municipalities, and then selected 2 cases that are economically rather well off, have a relatively low unemployment rate, and then 2 cases that are a bit the opposite of that, and that also experienced, for instance, demographic decline and have a rather aging population. Experience with cultural diversity, what we mean by that is that we also looked at the composition of the local population. So we now have 2 cases. That is the medium-sized town in the province Utrecht and the small town in Overijssel that have more than 25% people with a migration background. And then we have 2 cases, that is the small town in the province South Holland and the rural area in Drenthe, where more than 90% of local residents have a Dutch background. So we really try to have quite some variation in all the cases that could potentially also help us understand why approaches may also differ depending on the case that we look at. So what we did then, after selecting the cases, we read a lot of policy and legal documents, a lot of newspaper articles. And I also conducted a lot of interviews with public and non-public stakeholders at different government levels. We also spoke to local residents, organized some focus group, and also to refugees and other migrants residing in the localities. Now I will start sharing a bit of the insights, and I would like to start with the national and the regional context, sort of also characterize a bit the national context in the Netherlands, because this is of course very important to also then understand what is going on locally, because despite all the multi-level governance that we can see nowadays, the national level does still play a very important role. In the Netherlands, the approach to immigrant integration can be described as rather centralized, so the national level stirs a lot of the processes from above. There's a national dispersal mechanism in place that regulates how asylum seekers and also recognized refugees are distributed across the country. For instance, every 6 months, the national government or a national implementing body determines how many refugees are allocated to each municipality. So each municipality in the Netherlands has to take refugees in. They also have to find housing for them, but this is determined by the national level. There is also a national integration policy in place, the so-called Wet Inburgering, so a Civic Integration Act. Importantly, there has been quite a big change now in January 2022, giving the municipalities a much more important role in integration policy making. But before that, so since 2013 until very recently, the municipalities had a rather limited role in this policy area. And there are also nationally defined legal tasks. What I mean by that is that, for instance, the municipalities have to find housing for recognized refugees, and they also have to provide social support to these refugees. So the carrying out of the tasks is again the responsibility of the local level, but what the task entails is defined at the national level. Importantly, maybe as a sort of disclaimer, I will be focusing on integration policies concerning recognized refugees or status holders. Of course, there are also many other migrants currently living in the Netherlands, but this is what I will primarily be focusing on. And this is just to exemplify this a bit. So we have the national level that is responsible for the reception of asylum seekers, for the processing of the asylum applications, also for the issuance of the international protection permits. It's also responsible for the allocation of refugees to different municipalities and to sort of distribute them also across the country. Then the local level comes in, so that each municipality has to provide housing. So usually they assign refugees to available social housing in the city. This task is supervised by the provincial level. So this is where the provinces come in. The provinces, they have a very limited role in this policy area, but they have a supervising role for this specific legal task. Then once the refugees live in the municipalities, they start their so-called inburgeringstraject, or their civic integration trajectory. This means that they, for example, follow Dutch language courses. And during the time that they do that, the municipalities are also responsible to provide social support to help refugees with all kinds of administrative tasks. And later on, municipalities also help refugees to find employment, also a task defined under the Participation Act. That's a bit this more national framework, the rather clear-cut distribution of responsibilities. It seems rather also top-down. Of course, the local level also has some say in integration policymaking at the national level because they're also represented by an association. But this is the rather clear-cut responsibility or distribution of responsibilities. But of course, the local level or the local authorities, they don't do this all by themselves. They also collaborate with local partners, with different NGOs, with housing corporations, also with local businesses to carry out certain tasks. And this is where we now zoom a bit more into the local context. And what we see here, which is perhaps even a bit surprising, is that the localities chose rather different approaches to the topic of immigrant integration. Despite this rather rigid, centralized approach with a national civic integration act in place, this national dispersal mechanism and tasks that are rather clearly defined, there are quite some variation when we look more particularly at how integration policymaking and policy implementation is then negotiated on the ground. For example, we have a medium-sized town in Utrecht, which has an inclusive city agenda. They also have an anti-discrimination policy. Immigrant or newcomer integration is really on top of the political agenda. They rather proudly also present themselves as a welcoming and diverse and inclusive city, and as having also a very unique approach. They have a quite big NGO, a sort of one-stop shop that provides refugees with all kinds of support related to housing, employment, language, and also all kinds of administrative matters. And here integration is also defined as a two-way process, as facilitating participation on equal terms with the local community. This is, for instance, very different in the small town in Overijssel, where there are rather generic or mainstream policy programs where refugees are not particularly mentioned, but rather put in the group of potentially vulnerable groups that may need additional attention. The city also describes itself as a rather poor city. It has a relatively high share of people who receive welfare benefits. So refugees are then also not seen as this benefit or something positive, but rather as a burden on the welfare system. They also have a neighborhood approach, so not a targeted policy, but it's very much neighborhood-based, and integration is here defined in rather economic terms. So the goal of integration is to facilitate self-sufficiency and economic participation. The localities also differ in terms of the social support structure that is in place and the actors that are locally involved in integration governance. For example, in the small town in South Holland, the municipality has very consciously chosen to transfer all the main tasks, so housing, social support, and employment, to 3 different service providers or to 3 different NGOs. And in the rural area in Drenthe, the picture looks quite differently. Here, the municipality has very consciously chosen to organize most of the tasks in-house. So they, of course, also collaborate with local partners, but to a smaller extent, they have dedicated klant managers, how they're called, that were also hired to really guide newcomers and refugees through the process of arrival and to also support them in finding employment. Of course, there are I don't want to overstate all these differences. There are, of course, also similarities. Perhaps we also have time to talk about these a bit later on. For instance, besides the medium-sized town, all others also say that, yeah, we don't have that many refugees coming in, especially in the rural area. There are maybe 20 refugees coming every few months. So that's also one of the reasons why there's not a specific targeted integration policy, but refugees are rather recognized as a sort of one of other vulnerable groups that need special attention. And that's a bit similar. This narrative is a bit similar also in the other towns. Of course, we were then wondering what could also explain these differences. And then we looked again at the national legal framework. And here, interestingly, is that also with the old Civic Integration Act that ascribed the municipalities a rather limited role, that this could also be one explanation why there are these differences, because the municipalities had much more freedom on also carving out their own role and deciding what role they would like to play, if they indeed want to allocate more funding, what type of actors they would also collaborate with. And more generally speaking, there's of course always also some leeway in policy implementation. For example, under the Participation Act, municipalities can decide if they want to use sanctions also for people who may have more difficulties or are not so willing to accept a certain job offer, for example. So municipalities also have some leeway here in deciding. But there are also other oh, yeah. Maybe a few words about the graphs on the side. This is just to exemplify a bit how, despite the centralized approach, the picture on the ground, so to say, can also differ. So here I try to map also the relevant actors that are involved. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, but just to also show that the amount of actors, the type of actors, and the importance of certain actors and their role in integration governments can also differ per locality. Just one example here, locality A has this one-stop shop, this very important specialized NGO only for refugees, but they also have other informal actors. They have a group of volunteers that is very, very active since 2015. They really also emerged as a sort of response to the increased arrival of refugees in the city. They have a very active Facebook group now where they also mobilize certain resources. And they also provide important services to refugees, but to a very different extent, or also in a different way than the specialized NGO who receives very targeted funding also by the municipalities to provide services and to carry out legal tasks. And this is also what was a bit discussed in the article by Campomori and Ambrosini, that there's not just one type of non-public actor, but also non-public actors can be very different in the way they're set up, in the way they provide resources, and the way they function. Other reasons for these diverging approaches that we saw can also be found more in the very local, locality-specific context. Structure. The economic structure also plays a role. So that's what I briefly mentioned in the beginning, that of course in the town that describes itself as very much as a poor city, refugees that are then mainly seen as future social welfare recipients, seen as a burden, while in the other town that is also economically better off, there it's much more seen as a benefit to the city, as something enriching. Size also matters, of course. In a medium-sized town, we see much more organizations, formal and informal, involved in integration governance. In the rural area, in Drenthe, for example, there are really only a few who are concerned with the topic. Now I would also say would like to say something about dynamics of cooperation and conflict, but with a focus on conflict. Of course, there are a lot of cooperation networks in place at the national and regional level. There are city networks. There's the Association of Dutch Municipalities. That's important for municipalities to lobby also for their interest towards the national government. There are regional cooperation networks where both public and non-public actors are involved. But what we also saw based on our interviews, that there are also quite some tensions and conflicts sometimes that are also part of the governance process and the policymaking process. Municipalities have, for instance, complained about the lack of funding and also said that with the available funding, they cannot really facilitate the integration of newcomers long term. And as I have already briefly mentioned, there are also quite some diverging perspectives and approaches with regards to what integration actually is and how it should also be approached or addressed at the local level. Then at the local level, there are local partnerships. There are very formalized or institutionalized performance agreements, for instance, between the municipality and the housing corporation when it comes to the legal task of housing. And there are also regular meetings with other actors that are involved, both formal and informal. So there is definitely a sort of collaboration network also in place in all the localities. However, what we have also seen is that there is also potential for conflict. And one example that I found quite interesting was in the medium-sized town in the province of Utrecht, where there was a conflict, actually not so much between the public and non-public actors, but between two non-public actors, one formal one, the very specialized NGO providing support to refugees on behalf of the municipality. And then informal actors, namely the group of volunteers who were also very much present or have been very much present also in the field since 2015. And there was a tension between the two because they could not really agree on what the right type of help is, how much help should be given, to whom the help should be given, because this is something that we've also seen that certain organizations that are funded by the municipality, they have a much narrower focus, and they also much narrower in terms of their service provision when it comes to certain target groups, while other more informal actors, they're much more open. They're also not so bound by the funding that they receive. So they also provide their services, for example, to asylum seekers, to rejected asylum seekers, or to family migrants. So not only to the category of recognized refugees. And here again, this is also related to these diverging perspectives and approaches. So who should also receive help, who is considered also in a way as deserving, and what leeway do different organizations also have in providing their services. And this already brings me to the conclusion. And here I found also besides multi-level governance and the concept provided by Campomuri and Ambrosini very helpful, this idea of refugee reception, or also immigrant integration policymaking as a sort of battleground, because it is obviously very important to understand the multi-level system in place, to see how responsibilities are transferred, who is responsible for what, but to also understand what this means in the local context, how policymaking is then also localized in a way. And here the battleground concept is quite useful to really also look at conflict, not only cooperation, at convergence and divergence, and to also see other type of non-public actors that also can play an important role, such as this group of volunteers that I mentioned, or also in another municipality, for example, there were also protesters, and local authorities were also very much influenced by people going on the streets and saying, we actually do not want these refugees here, and we have a problem with that. And this, of course, also plays a role in policy implementation at the local level. And here it's therefore also important to really look at these sort of values, at potentially conflicting interests, and also frames and understanding dynamics, because it makes a very big difference if a municipality conceives of integration as a sort of two-way process that involves the entire community, or if it is rather something that relies or that involves primarily the individual, and where the entire responsibility of integrating also lies on the shoulders of the newcomer. And this also then shapes in turn the local approach to immigrant integration policymaking. Okay, that was it. I look very much forward to your questions, and yeah, I will get back to the